Welcome to All the Best, an interview series with UNL Orca awardees, where UNL means University of Nebraska-Lincoln, and Orca is the Outstanding Research and Creativities Award, which is UNL's top award. In Gerda Lerner's book, Why History Matters, she explains the life stories give meaning to the present and the future because we identify what is important to us. And she says, our stories show how we are interconnected in a particular time and place. As for this interview series, Orca awardees have experiences that reach back more than a half a century, which will give us a personal view of how the best research emerged from UNL. It is my pleasure to introduce today's interviewee, Emeritus Professor Michael James. He was awarded the Orca in 2009. After I provide a quick summary of his life and career, Michael will tell us about his time at UNL, starting with his award-winning research. Michael was born in New Bedford, Massachusetts. Something in his youth must have sparked an interest in the arts because he earned a Bachelor and Master of Fine Arts, both with an emphasis on painting and printmaking. His bachelor's was from the University of Massachusetts at Dartmouth, and his master's was from the Rochester Institute of Technology. After graduation, he embarked on a 26-year career as an independent studio quilt designer and maker. His career took a new direction in spring 2000 when he was a visiting lecturer in textiles at his Dartmouth alma mater. In fall 2000, he arrived at the UNL campus as a senior lecturer in the Department of Textiles, Merchandising, and Fashion Design. He quickly jumped to the tenure track as a full professor and soon thereafter became chair of his department. He's had a remarkable career with dozens of solo exhibitions with work in over 20 public collections, including the Smithsonian's Renwick Gallery. He retired in 2020 and has begun writing books. With that, I want to welcome Michael to the interview.
Hello, Mark.
All right. Let us start with your impression of the UNL campus when you saw it for the very first time, and then what are your thoughts about it today?
I saw it for the very first time in 1977. The very first time I actually traveled west of the Mississippi, and certainly the very first time I came to Nebraska. And I have absolutely no recollection whatsoever of that drive by. So I can more appropriately probably um, answer that moving forward 20 years to 1997 when I was invited to be a member of the inaugural International Advisory Board of what was then called the International Quilt Study Center,
Hmm.
which was established in the department in that year. And I think my impressions of the campus have held. It's functional. Um, and it's, I think, pretty typical of most large state campuses across the country. It's, it's most of these campuses never had any kind of grand master plan for development, and so everything's kind of hit or miss. I do think that the open area that's bordered by the lead center on the south, the um, uh, one of the art buildings on the north, the Sheldon Art Museum on the east, and Architecture Hall on the west. I think that's probably the nicest spot of all the of both campuses, both West Campus and East Campus. I said that once in front of an upper administrator who quickly corrected me. It's City Campus. Um, And certainly the Sheldon Art Museum is a gem of a building, not just for the campus, but for the state. But it's it functions.
All right, great. So let's jump right into your award-winning research. Give us a sense of how you came about to be a quilt maker and what you actually have to do to make quilts and why is it important?
Um, well, I got out of graduate school where I'd gotten my Master of Finance degree, which pretty much still is the terminal degree in sort of the arts, what I would call the arts of practice. Uh, a doctoral degree exists today, but it's a stretch to say that it really informs studio practice. It informs the discourse around studio practice, I think. But in any case, I came out with a painting degree, a painting major focus, and printmaking was my secondary focus. And shortly after I got out of grad school, I stopped painting and printmaking altogether and turned to fabric. And I can only say that there was a deep attraction to textiles, which I didn't quite connect at the time with my uh, family background. And in time, I began to understand that there was a long history of involvement with textiles, not in any kind of artistic way at all, but there was something visceral about textiles that appealed to me, and I started exploring that. It was it was the mid 1970s, so the focus on the bicentennial put a lot of attention on the historic and the traditions of handmaking in this country, and so there was a lot of uh, uh, stuff out there in the media that piqued my interest, and so uh, since I'm a person who's self-described as bookish, kind of bibliophile, I raided the library, the public library at uh, in Rochester, New York, and took out everything that I could find on the tradition of patchwork and quilts and so on, and really explored that. And in in the short term, I got a real good education in that revolutionary era that we were celebrating at the time, and it dawned on me around that time that there might be something original that could be done with this that to that point few people had done. So I combined my interest in geometry with fabric and then took it from there. Uh, what has come out of that 50 years later, as we approach the what is this next one?
100,
Uh,
250?
yeah, but what's that called?
Oh,
250. It's got a name. I can't
Quaz
think of it.
Qua or something.
I can't think of it right now. But anyway, um, there is you know, what didn't exist in 1975 was this expansive global community of makers who were connected through media, and when I say that, I mean primarily print media through the 70s and 80s into the 90s, and then social media that has linked all of these enthusiasts of of quilts and quilt making and their histories uh, into a kind of, you know, worldwide community. And a big portion of that community is interested in what today is called art quilts, a term that I despise. And I have despised it since people started using it, but I lost that battle a long time ago. Uh, because my contention, and I say that because my contention from the start has always been that all quilts are art. And um, that kind of 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 making of property that has aesthetic importance, whose being is at least in part and in fairly large part aesthetic, is art. And then you know, from there you got all kinds of debates. Is it good art? Is it bad art? Whatever. Is it derivative art? Is it original art? None of that matters. So my preferred term when people have to have a label is studio quilts.
Mm.
And that to me references the practice that a serious maker engages in spaces dedicated to that platform. Does that answer your question? Or
Yeah, that's pretty
did
good.
I?
So tell us, so I can now get a better sense. So you printmaking, you learned that as a secondary emphasis, and
Yeah.
obviously you've got to print onto some surface, and at some point you're going to realize, well, the surface really does something for me.
Actually, that came more out of the painting because
Oh.
I, when I was finishing my graduate work, I was, this was the early 70s. I had come out of a tradition, both in undergraduate school and graduate school, of a tradition that was very much informed by abstract expressionism, which was fading out at that time. The art world was in flux, and I was, I had primarily been interested in non-figurative, non-representational imagery. So I was working in a sort of what would be called a kind of color field environment. Um, People who might know Helen Frankenthaler's work, my work had connections to hers and people like Morris Lewis and so on and so forth. And in that process of that kind of color field work, I was painting on unprimed canvas
Hmm.
and mostly pouring or wetting the surface and then dripping paint into it and manipulating that. Uh, and I found after some time, as the work was developing, that I was becoming more interested in the unpainted areas, which was the raw canvas. So there was in that the sort of germ of this transition to just working with fabric, because there was something in the tactility of the medium of the material that appealed to me. Um, and of course, today in hindsight, I fully get where I was coming from uh, as the descendant of, on both sides of my family, many generations of textile mill workers. My uh, Irish ancestors were cottage weavers, and they emigrated from Ireland to Lancashire in the mid 19th century and got fully immersed in the industrial, which was already beginning to change the the Industrial Revolution, it was certainly, it was still at kind of a high point, but there were implications on the horizon that things were not going to be able to be sustained at that level. Eventually, they came to this country at about the same time that my Canadian ancestors came from Quebec to all of them to work in New England textile mills. And so I grew up in the shadow of one of these textile mills that I have a photograph of the mill right by my,
Mhm.
and that was taken in 1945. And I grew up in the shadow of that mill, literally in the shadow of it. We never saw the sunset because when the sunset was happening, the mill was 4 stories high. It was always in the way. Um, uh, and uh, and now that mill is completely gone as of about maybe, I'm going to guess 10, 12 years ago. They
Mhm.
tore it down. But it's now I feel privileged to have that, to be part of a lineage that has built lives around textiles.
Mhm.
Certainly, I've built it in a completely different way.
Mhm.
And I'm one of the first people in my family, and I mean family, not my immediate family, but I mean generational, to have solidly landed in the middle class.
Mhm.
Um, and so it's an interesting, and right now all the research I'm doing is around that because I'm working on a book that has to do with their lives, some of my ancestors, and I'm still learning a lot about the textile industry. It's rich and it's really vast, I would say. So anyway, that's where my uh,
Sure.
impulses come from, I think.
So, but let's come back to this 26 years as an independent artist, and then you've come to UNL, and then looks like 9 years later, you won the Orca. So I
Right.
assume that the Orca was for mostly what you did while you were at UNL, or was it your whole?
I think it took into account everything I had done
Okay.
to that point, including the work that I was doing at the time at UNL, and I was still producing a
Mhm.
significant amount of work
Mhm.
with the help of a studio assistant, um, Leah Sorensen Hayes, who had been one of my graduate students. Well, she was assigned to me as my graduate student when I first arrived in 2000. And although I had a couple of other graduate students assigned to me after that, Leah and I maintained our studio relationship. And after she got her degree in 2002, I believe, uh, I employed her myself in my studio to do. It was typically around 10 hours a week that I paid her to help me keep my work going. I was still obviously in the studio, but I just didn't have the hours that I would have liked or that I would have had before I became an academic. And and then 5 years after I came to UNL, I was uh, promoted to full professor uh, with the artist James, no relation, uh, the artist James professorship in textiles, clothing, and design. And that uh, also came at the time when I was appointed as department chair, uh, a role in which I served for 15 years. And at that point, I um, negotiated with the college uh, a part-time position for Leas because I knew that as department chair, plus with with teaching duties and all the other stuff that goes with it, there was no way I would be able to sustain much of studio production. And so with her help for the next 15 years, I was able to keep my production going. And before I came to UNL, typically I would get 6 or 7, sometimes 8. One rare year I did 10 large. When I say large, I mean anything over about 60 inches square ballpark. I'd get, 6 to 7, let's say, pieces, major pieces done in a year. So averaging basically 2 point something every, I mean, one piece every 2 point some months, something like that. And so with Leah's help, between us, we were able to keep that production pretty close to that level. And so I was able to continue to exhibit and you know all that stuff. Um,
No, that sounds really good. So lead us through the process of making a quilt.
well, you know,
What are the
it,
steps?
you got to have an idea first. That's, I mean, it's. I've always approached it exactly like I approach painting. It's like it's it's any of the arts. You start with nothing but an idea, and with that idea, you start to kind of visualize or conceptualize a form that that idea might be given body in. And then you start to try to, you know, make it real. And, it's interesting, of course, I think one of the factors that contributed to my decision to get out of painting when I was just out of grad school was that time there was the advent of conceptual art, where the idea was the thing. You could, get away with stating the idea, maybe on a small board, and that's it. You didn't have to produce a thing, an object. And that was revolutionary at the time. Well, it seemed revolutionary at the time. And today it's sort of, dirty girl, as the French would say. But uh, I was not interested in that, and I wasn't interested in performance, and I wasn't interested in um, installation art. Although I'm very interested in those things, as an observer, I'm not. It wasn't something I wanted to be doing. I needed much more material, and I don't mean by fabric that by fabric. I mean the substance of things in my hands to do
Mhm.
something with.
Mhm.
Um, so so whether it's pigment that's slapped on a canvas or a board or paper or whatever, or whether it's pieces of fabric that are, you know, just autonomous pieces of fabric that get reworked and combined to create some new kind of expression. It's just, you know, I I was always in my work was always informed by traditions, by patchwork, technical traditions. I by the late 70s, I was working in a form with which I'm still today identified, although I stopped working with that form in the 1990s. But I worked with it for roughly 15 years. And it's what in the quilt world is called strip piecing. And what it involves is cutting long strips of fabric and spending hours and hours sewing those strips together complete busy work, but busy work that has to be done very precisely. There's very little room for carelessness or sloppiness. It's got to be really refined. And once those strip panels, mine were usually involved 36 colors in uh, sequences that sometimes had musical kind of overtones because I did use music as well. I used aural inspiration as much as visual inspiration. Uh, those panels would then be cut into smaller pieces, sections, and those sections combined,
Mm.
and all of that development was done on the walls of my studios, as because I had several in that course of time. And so it it was always a building of relationships, of formal relationships, in search of an expression of more sort of metaphysical, maybe, um, ideas. And in that sense, it never felt any different than working in with any other materials. For me, it was studio practice. It
Mm.
was going in the studio and just standing in front of that wall and making something happen on it.
Mm.
And now it's still the I'm doing some visual work, but it's not my primary focus right now. But and I'm working on a much smaller scale now, back to painting or mixed media. Each engagement, even if the panel I'm working on is only, you know, 10 by 12 inches, it's the same thing. And it takes time to get to the point where what you see in front of you is an expression of what you're feeling inside you, um, in, in a substantive way. And I mean, it's always for me had to be more than just something that was pleasing to the eye.
Mm.
It had to evoke some kind of response. Now, the response it might evoke in a viewer can be 100% different from the response it might reflect in me. Um, but it, if somebody, and I hear this once in a while, I'll cross paths with somebody who'll say, "Oh, I remember seeing this quilt of yours in this exhibition or at this museum or whatever." And it keeps coming back to me. I think about that quilt often. Well, that's great, because that's the end game, really, that it would impress itself on someone in such a way that they would keep mentally coming back to it over time. And I mean, because I know that feeling. I admire many artists' work that if I saw the artist, I would say, "Oh my God, thank you for that piece," because that piece still, it's one of my,
Mm.
guideposts
Mm.
or whatever, however it functions in one's life. So,
So it sounds like the fabric plays a major role. Tell me how you collect your fabric.
well, I used to frequent fabric stores everywhere I went. In the 70s, I started teaching in this quilt domain, and in a fairly short amount of time, partly because I had written two books about process
Mm.
back in the late 70s, I started being invited to do workshops and lectures all over the country, and then eventually all over the world. And so for fully 25 years, I I earned, my day job in a way. The way I could sustain my studio was by going out on the road and lecturing and teaching, and I did a lot of that. So wherever I went, whether it was overseas or anywhere in this country, I'd always look for two things, the bookstores and the fabric stores. And I would always bring home, you know, stuff that I couldn't find where I was. So I built a collection that way. And um, wonderfully, one of the brilliant pieces about coming here to UNL, and this kind of reflects the Medici role that is often uh, connected to universities. My department, thanks to one of my colleagues in the department, acquired a digital textile printer, which in 2000 or 2002, it came into the department in 2002, was a pretty unique thing to have as a tool. And this colleague was doing research using soybeans to create the dyes for these digital textile printers. So his purposes were were scientific, and the machine allowed him to actually print stuff and that he could test to see if it was achieving the qualities he was after. Well, I saw right away the potential in this machine from a design standpoint, from an aesthetic standpoint. And I started, well, first thing I did was I knew if I didn't really learn the technology that came with this machine, there were programs built into it, software programs that included design layouts and all this stuff. And I didn't, and if I didn't learn at that point to really integrate that machine's design capabilities with other platforms like Photoshop and Illustrator, and which I was using on a very kind of modest scale at the time because I was still resisting. The remnants of Ludditism was
Yeah.
still
Yeah.
lurking in the background. I decided I really had to, this was too good an opportunity to overlook. So I applied myself really intensively for about 6 months to learn all this stuff. And surprisingly, we had other design faculty, but I was the only design faculty member in the department who was interested in, you know, in putting focus on that. And so the upshot was then I had this tool that I could use to create my own fabric. And it was really the complete end of ever purchasing commercial fabric again.
Do you have any of those pieces
Oh,
anymore?
I have a whole
You
little
got
storeroom full.
them.
Yeah. I've got examples that go back to 2002. I've got pieces of fabric that still go back to 2002. Um, I've got to figure out at some point what happens to this collection of, because it's unique. Every piece in it, every single piece is one of a kind. This doesn't exist anywhere else. Um, but we're in a world today where uh, the it's I don't know. I'm a little pessimistic about the the arts broadly today, and so I think in the long run, um, all of this could just be it could be lost.
Well,
It's
I think
it's
art requires the attention span of the viewer, and I don't think that we are
we're going in the
training.
other
Yeah,
direction.
we're going, yeah, absolutely. So the attention span has decreased even more since when we were younger.
It's interesting. We had some young people here yesterday. Uh, all under the age of, well, let's say the oldest was 31, down to 14 years old. We live in a house that has a lot of art around the house. Interesting, what I think are interesting objects. Not over the course of 4 or 5 hours, not one single question,
Oh,
not one turn of the head,
oh,
zero consciousness of anything that, at least when I go in somebody's house and there's interesting things on the wall, I stop and look and say, you know, is this so and so? Or where did you get this? Or, who's the artist? Whatever,
yeah.
you know?
I would probably be looking at all the books on your bookshelf.
Well, that's another thing. It's none of these young people read.
No,
They don't read.
no. So I want to go back to the printing of the
Yeah,
fabric on this
yeah.
machine. So my two big questions are, what pigments did you use, and did you use any of these experimental soybean pigments on any of your works?
Well, here's the deal. The machine used what I call reactive dyes. Those are dyes that have to merge with uh, like a fixative. That's just a, a, a product. It's kind of a coal ash derivative that that allows the fabric to absorb the dye and keep it.
Mhm,
So we had to buy pre-treated fabric that
mhm,
had
mhm.
the soda ash,
Oh.
uh, whatever it was. I'm not a chemist, and that piece of it isn't doesn't never did and still doesn't interest me.
Oh.
But my interest went this far in the chemical piece. I wanted to use dyes that would have um, light resistance,
Mhm,
fade resistance,
mhm,
and that was part of what my colleague and other
mhm, mhm,
people like him were after.
mhm,
And and the other thing they were after was a black dye that was really black.
mhm,
Because in my first few years of using the printer, that was one of my frustrations. The black dye was never really tended more to lean toward like a deep chocolate color
mhm,
or a bluish color, a
mhm,
deep,
mhm,
deep, deep navy,
mhm.
not really black. But in time, after a number of years, the blacks got really black, and that was wonderful. Um, so it was. What was your question?
About the dyes, what dyes did you use?
Oh
How
yeah,
did you
the
treat them?
reactive dyes.
Yeah.
And we had to once they the printer used a what's called a piezo head, and it's a mechanism that sprays droplets of
Mhm,
dye onto
mhm,
the fabric surface, and it dries fairly quickly. I mean, by the time it got rolled up, it was dry, but it wasn't. It needed then to have one final process, which was steaming it at a certain
mhm,
temperature for a certain
mhm,
amount of
mhm,
time. And eventually we first we used these kind of manual steamers that where you had to boil the water and put the thing over in a tube, and it was awkward. We eventually bought a commercial grade steamer, and that was way more efficient. And I will add, because I know you're going to ask about grants and such, this
Yeah.
kind of fits in with that a little. When I got my professorship in 2005, the Artist James professorship in clothing, textiles, and design, it came with a stipend.
Mm,
It paid part of my salary, but it also came with an annual stipend. And the first 5 years, that was about a 10,000, I think it was a $10,000 stipend
nice.
that had to be, of course, used through the system in the
Mhm,
department.
mhm,
But that stipend is what supported the equipment, the dyes, because a leader of the reactive dye was around $300, and there were 8 colors. So every time you had to buy new dye, it was, you know, between $2,000 and $3,000 to
Wow.
replace those dyes. And the dyes also had a shelf life, as you'd
Mm,
understand.
mm.
So you had to keep on those dyes. And the fabric, of course, we had to order all that. So it was a very expensive enterprise that an individual artist such as myself would never have been able to. Just the machine alone, we uh, we replaced the machine in 2010, I believe. So we used it for about 8 years. And at that point, the reason we had to replace it was because we needed parts and they were no longer making the parts for it because they called it a dinosaur. So in 8 short years, this machine, which was many thousands of dollars, was a dinosaur. The replacement, you know, you could have bought a car for the cost of the replacement, and a nice car. So so that was where that money
Mm.
came from. Um, so you know, I was very fortunate in that regard. Um,
No,
but
that sounds really good.
yeah,
So then when you've got it printed and fixed, how do you assemble the quilt?
well, you know, um, my techniques by that point were pretty straightforward. I had stopped doing the strip piecing, which was,
Yeah.
I had just reached the point where I just physically couldn't do it anymore. It was just,
Mhm.
it was too much. And, I couldn't mentally do it anymore either, which was probably more important. So my structures in all the digital work that I did over the years were relatively simple, straightforward. Uh, what I would say uncomplicated because I was more interested in what the imagery was doing in these
Mhm.
compositions that I
Mhm.
was making and what sensations it was putting forward, what sort of emotional resonances it was stimulating.
So the stitching doesn't really, you're not focused on the stitching at all at that
Well,
point.
no, the stitching is important, and this is. I'm glad you brought that up because I always tend to give sort of privilege or primacy to the surface imagery,
Yeah.
but the the substance of what the object was, i.e., quilt,
Mhm.
which implied 3 layers, top, back, and a filling layer. The quilting through of that and the patterns of the quilting
Mhm.
were textural complements to the visual
Mhm.
stuff that the fabric was representing. And once I moved into the chair position, I no longer had time to do the quilting because that is enormously time consuming. And you're working always in inches per minute or, you know, yards per hour over many days and weeks to get one of these pieces quilted. But that texture gave it it gave a well it heightened that tactile appeal, and it accentuated the fiber dimensions of the
Mhm.
object.
Mhm.
And you know it was additional stimuli. And in fact, if you looked at a top unquilted next to a quilted top, you would see an enormous uh, increase in uh, resonance in the quilted piece versus the unquilted
Mhm.
piece. And Leah did, my former studio assistant, Leah Sorensen Hayes, did almost all of the quilting through from that period from 2005 to 20,000. I
Mhm.
mean, to 2020 when I retired. Uh, and I did I did a little bit of quilting on some pieces when we were under pressure to get work done for a show, but she did most of it. And that is the only way that all that work could have been completed. So and Leah, she was she still is. She's like me. She's a perfectionist, and I worked with enough other students who were very good at what I assigned them to do, often excellent, but I really required perfectionism because I needed it. It needed to replicate how I would approach the piece. And she easily, I think easily, she never complained, brought that to the work. And she does her own textile work, always did. And so I would explain or teach her the technique I used for a certain thing, and that's the technique she used, even if she used something completely different on her own work. And that's optimal,
Mhm.
you know.
Mhm.
But she had an understanding of what I wanted in the piece and of how I would get that. And so we feel it, initially I would draw out some of the quilting lines. Like I'd start the drawing directly on the fabric. This is what I want. But eventually it she understood. I didn't need to tell her on every single piece what to do in each part. She could do that.
Mhm.
And and every time I look at one of the pieces, that's just what I wanted. It's perfect. It's wonderful.
So
And
what is she doing today?
she's an independent studio designer. She's designing a lot of fabric that's that she puts out on the market. Um, and once in a while, I hire her to do something for me if she has time. So we managed to stay. I missed that relationship because it was just I always felt secure to turn my studio over to her because I trusted her completely, implicitly, and I still do because her judgment is super on target, and I only have superlatives, um, but they well deserved.
Mhm.
You know, I always felt a little compromised when I did evaluations, whether it was faculty or students, when the performance was at such a high level that you only had superlatives, you know. And I think, well, what could I invent to say, maybe he or she should work a little more. Some people just do their job so well, you
Sure.
know. So,
Well, maybe that's a good segue to my next question. You've been a chair for a long time. You've had to evaluate faculty. And in science, where I'm from, we define impact in very specific ways. How do you define impact in your field? And um, what sorts of activities did the faculty engage in to get high impact?
well, our department, which by the middle of 2027 will no longer exist.
Right.
Um, our department was very diverse. We had science, we had design, we still have all these things, but it's going to disappear shortly. We had have business, or in our case, merchandising. Also, in addition to that, history and material culture, uh, those were actually overlapped with the design piece a fair amount, and also with the the science piece a bit, maybe less with the merchandising piece. But because we had that diverse department, a department chair was somewhat challenged to learn about all these other areas, because the standards were different in each,
Mm.
you know. And I know you're going to ask about associations or affiliations with
Yeah.
academic organizations and so on. They were different in for almost every faculty member, really.
Oh,
Although the the design faculty, the at least the fashion and clothing people, their big organization was the International Textile and Apparel Association. Now, I I joined that and participated in it, although I never did. I never submitted papers or anything like that, because it wasn't, you know, what I did. Um, uh, they did though. That's where those faculty presented and, you know, uh, published in proceedings and stuff like that.
so impact is society
Those
engagement.
those of us who were these visual makers, well, we had the College Art Association,
Mm.
which we didn't have a major departmental connection to it, but I would sometimes go to the CAA conferences, usually because I wanted to enforce a kind of small bit of representation for the studio crafts,
Mm.
which were largely ignored by the College Art Association, at least back in those days. But we were connected to arts groups that weren't, well, there is one called the American Quilt Study Group, and some of the faculty presented and published papers through them. Um, then in the merchandising piece, well, that was largely, I'm sorry, I already talked about that. That was in ITAA. In the textile science area, well, Ichi, this colleague, uh, frequented quite a lot of conferences, both in this country and overseas, especially in China. So he was very much networked in that domain, and very highly published and very well cited in his in his discipline. So, you as a chair look evaluating this stuff every year. I just looked at numbers and you know outputs, and those were that was the criteria around
Mm.
which. So for him, he might have 14 peer reviewed publications in a year.
Yeah.
Other people might have two or three, but they also had an exhibit, or they got a grant of some sort or whatever. And but the visual faculty, like myself, uh, Wendy Weiss, it was a matter of mostly exhibitions, getting your work in the
Mm.
public
Mm.
space,
Mm.
uh, getting it reviewed, having notice. So, you know, it was it was measurable,
Mm.
and it was definitely obvious when somebody wasn't producing or
Mm.
wasn't at the level that we felt they should be at that point in time.
Mm.
So you got to make more of an effort next year.
Yeah. Okay. So We haven't talked about exhibitions. You've had quite a few. So tell us about your exhibitions, or what I've posed the question as, what was your most unexpected exhibition and did it take your work in a new direction?
Well, it's interesting that I thought about that question, and I would say this. I don't think for most artists there's ever an unexpected exhibition because when you set a date for an exhibition, that becomes that becomes the focus for whatever length of time you have between setting the date and actually walking in the door. And usually it's at least a year, but often 2 or 3 years out
So they're
before.
all planned.
So there's nothing unexpected. Now, maybe you could have an unexpected response
Mhm.
from, you know, from the media that pay attention to that sort of thing. And that, whether it's a good response or a negative response, I guess that could happen. Um, so maybe I'd rephrase your question and say, what exhibition have you had that um, I don't even know how to phrase the question. I already know the answer. That's the thing.
So we're,
I'll talk about the answer, and then you or your listeners can
how about which of
fabricate.
your exhibitions had the most unexpected response?
Well, the exhibition that I feel most strongly about my entire
Okay,
career,
there we go.
and I'm only talking about solo exhibitions here,
So most memorable.
uh, and it was the exhibition that I had in 2015 called Ambiguity and Enigma.
Mhm.
And it was held on campus at what was then called the International Quilt Study Center and Museum, which was part of the department still in 2015. And I had that exhibition in one of the galleries there that comprised 14 works that I had started working on in early 2013 and had worked on through 13, through 14, and into 15. So about 2.5 years of work, 14 pieces, some very large pieces that were all reflections on the experience of my first wife, Judith's Alzheimer's uh, journey. And she was diagnosed with, she also was a graduate of the department, had her master's degree, master of, master of arts degree with Leah, in fact, in 2002. They were side by side in the program when we came here. And she was diagnosed in 2009 with younger onset Alzheimer's. And so for the next 6 years, we were navigating that space in our personal lives while still, uh, while I was still on campus, of course, I was still doing full time in my position. And the show went up in June of 2015, and Judy died in August. So
Oh.
a little more than 2 months later. And the show was up until 2016. So
Mm.
uh, the whole process the of any dementia journey, whether it's Alzheimer's or Lewy body dementia or frontal temporal dementia or any number of, you know, semantic dementia, there's a whole range of variations. Uh, Navigating that is a long process of living with and navigating or managing ambiguous loss because the caregivers as well as the sufferer obviously is losing their minds, and the caregiver, whoever that um, is losing them in pieces and losing everything they've known as a unit, whether it's, parent child or spouse, close friend, whatever. Um, so you do a lot of that mourning, and in a way, making all those pieces was part of that experience of dealing with the loss and the emotional investments that that disease required. So, so the show goes up, and then Judy dies, and there was the show until the following February, I think. So it was up for 9 months or so. That was every time I walked in the gallery, it was a full immersion
Mm.
again in that. And it, it was good because it helped me adjust to a different kind of mourning. Because when everything you're mourning is embodied in that person, and that person's still breathing and moving and being, it's a different kind of mourning once they're they're gone. But it turned out to be good because it was, I don't like to use the word therapeutic. I did go into therapy in the last couple of years of her disease because I needed guidance on how to hold myself together, really. And the work in the studio wasn't the same. It wasn't therapy in that way, although it certainly, I'm sure it had therapeutic value. So so because of that, and the other piece of that is I love the work. It's a body of work that I feel is most my most sort of unified and consistent and integral,
Mm.
I guess. Uh, and it got to the points that I was trying to make. And also it really bridged this space between the object and poetry.
Mm.
So for me, it was, by then I really was conscious that I was trying to make visual poetry with these pieces. I was actually writing some poetry at this time too, and that some of that appeared in the exhibition. So I think it reached that level of the poetic. Now, 20 years, 50 years from now, my work, this is true for any visual artist, could be entirely forgotten, disappeared, gone. Happens all the time. There's museum basements full of work by artists that nobody knows. Even curators and institutions with big collections have no clue what all of what they have or who these artists are or were.
Mm.
The stuff sits there. That may happen. You know, who knows? It's that's an unanswerable question. The visual arts, just like the literary arts or any 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 of the arts, a very small handful of people get the spotlight
Sure.
for their generation. And there's worlds of artists out there who a gift. the gift to them is that they get to live a life in which everything is informed by their practice. And this is true for me, even though, see, I got to talk about something that's interesting because other academics should reflect on this, especially relative to the arts. That comes back to the question of how do you measure this stuff? Well, you don't measure it the way you measure a scientist's work or a sociologist's work or, you know, um, because that practice is so much a piece of being in the world and everything that you everything that's outward is tied to what you do when you stand in your studio or work or at your work table and start making things. And I I think most of the artists I've known, pretty much all of the practicing artists, I'm not necessarily talking about people who got a degree in art and then became whatever, got, mainstream jobs, became an accountant or whatever to get, to make a living. Didn't really, but people who made that their livelihood and their life. Um, where was I going with that?
So being
The
a
dot.
creative being and then being judged in some way of your impact.
Oh, I know where it's getting at. They're all iconoclasts. I'm, I was from a young age very much anti-authoritarian, and having grown up in a strict, devout Catholic family, went for 13 years from kindergarten through high school in strict, devout Catholic school. I worked my way up from the basement in kindergarten to the third floor high school. I became increasingly frustrated by the control and the limitations and the restrictions that were always imposed on you. Maybe it's very different today, but this was in the 1960s, in the 50s and 60s. Uh, so by the time I reached my senior year in high school, I was done with this authoritarianism, and it was, coming both from the community, from my family, from the school. And so when I got to college in 1967, it was like an opening. It was this enormous freeing of, and I was lucky because the faculty that I had in undergraduate school, some of them who'd come out of working class backgrounds as well, they understood this, and they really pushed us and challenged us to. It was almost like you could see them taking all these kids who, like me, were all first generation college students, mostly all with the same kind of textile mill worker backgrounds, but
Mm-hmm.
very, in any case, very working class backgrounds, putting us in these jars and shaking it and then throwing it out. And wherever you landed, you had to do something with it. And it was, I will give my parents credit. Once I got to college, they never, ever interfered. they were
mm,
supportive
mm,
of whatever what I was interested in doing. Um, in in graduate school, there was a little bit. It became a little tighter. I'm not sure exactly why. I have, I'm still to this day ambivalent about my grad school experience, about the education I got at that particular institution at that time. But the good thing about that, I will say, and this was at the Rochester Institute of Technology in Rochester, New York. While I was there, uh, or when I was there, I should say, the School for American Craftsmen, as it was called at the time, was in full gear, and it was a school that had kind of developed a little bit out of the Bauhaus
mm,
traditions of integrating handwork, the so-called craft arts with fine arts and
mm,
architecture and so on.
mm,
And so I had very up close perspectives on the making process relative to clay, ceramics, fiber, weaving, wood, furniture, metals, jewelry, all these things. I think at the time that I was there, glass was just getting off the ground, but they eventually had a
mm,
glass program. And so that was a kind of validation of these kinds of orientations, these kinds of practices that was important to my future. So once I started, I was I was self-employed. I didn't have an employer. I was independent and I could do what I want literally, and that's what I did. I want to do this. I'm going to figure out a way to make a living to do this, and I did. And I did it for 25 years. When I came to UNL, when I came out of the private sector into academia, it was convulsive. And in that first year, devastating is not an exaggeration. Honestly, honestly, I had no mechanisms for following mandates, enormous numbers of deadlines. I was very naive. And I got to tell this story, and I'm not, I, this story, I'm going to name the faculty member at UNL because she taught me a really good lesson. And I want to give her credit for that. Patrice McMahon, in my second year, I don't know how this happened. I was a senior lecturer. This doesn't happen. I got nominated to be on the research council.
Mm,
And then I got appointed. Oh, I don't want to do that. I don't have time for this. I'm developing all my courses. I'm teaching everything I'm teaching is the first time,
mhm.
stuff like this. There's all sorts of department stuff to deal with. And I get appointed to this. And somebody said to me, you really should do this because you'll get exposed to a wide range of stuff across campus. So I said yes. In fact, I very rarely ever said no. And there's some advantage to that because you don't learn much when you say no, but you learn a lot when you say yes. But anyway, so I come on this committee and we have a couple of meetings, and then it's time to review the first round of grants. So these are all the internal grants for UNL. So at the meeting where these grants are going to be distributed, these packages, the applications are going to be distributed among the members. We come in and there's a folder like this thick that is just my piece. It gets laid in front of me. Everybody else has this big folder. And I'm sitting there and thinking, there is no way. I cannot do this. There is no way. I just can't add this to, can't do this. And so, people are talking as they do around some some of the initial discussion around how this is going to proceed and what the timelines are and blah blah blah. And finally, I the chair was Jeff something or other. I can't think of his name, but he was in drama, I think. I'm sorry. There is I just don't see a way that I can fit this in. I just don't think I can do this. And Patrice McMahon was sitting. I started with a long list. I've got this. I've got.
Mhm.
She's sitting across from me. She just looks up and she goes, "What makes you think you're so different from the rest of us?" Okay. So um, I stayed on the committee and I managed to do it. And as I had been advised, it was a fantastic experience. And I was on the research council for 3 years. And I think I got reappointed for maybe a fourth year, something like that. And it was always great. It was just a great experience to see what people are doing, to understand better what each of these disciplines involved. And um, so I'll always be grateful that she said that to me, because if they had been kind of like, oh, okay, we understand, we'll split those up, you know.
All right, let's move on to the next question. This one's about interacting with, let's say, the public and your peers. What books have you written? And what curatorial activities have you done in society leadership? Any of those?
Well, I've not ever held any leadership positions in any of the, you know, studio craft world or art world uh, organizations.
Mhm.
That was something where, I mean, I didn't ever feel that I wanted to give time to that. I understand people's motivations who do want to.
Mhm.
um,
But you did not come out
but,
of the academic tradition,
here,
so
you
it
got
was
to keep,
not part of your job description to do that.
no, but people did. Even before I came into academia, there were organizations that, there's one called the Studio Art Quilt Associates. And it was created by a now deceased friend of mine uh, back in the 80s, I believe. I've long been a member of that organization, but you have to understand one thing about the quilt domain. It's the practice is largely uh, women, right? And rightly, because historically it was also mostly women who did this. There's a sense of ownership, and a person like myself, uh, I have to tread carefully. I always knew that. As feminist as my orientations were, I was still always suspect as a male, um, straight male, straight cisgender white male. So it never the opportunity. Let's put it this: the opportunity never came up to take on that leadership position. I did have some capacity for expressing opinions via my writing, and I was writing in some of the magazines
Mhm.
associated with this.
Mhm.
And that in the late 90s, I gave a talk at a conference that got published in one of the quilt magazines, and that stirred, you know, total tempest in a teapot, I guess. But it created a big stir, and I just decided then that it wasn't it wasn't constructive to be critical of that domain. So I've I've kept my thoughts to myself pretty much ever since when it comes to that stuff. But oh um,
So books. So you've written articles
I
in
wrote two quill books back in the
yeah.
late 70s. Those
Okay.
were they were published by Prentice Hall, and
Oh,
they were successful. You know, I was getting royalties into the 90s from those.
wow.
That was not bad. They eventually got bought by another uh, company uh, and re-edited, republished, and then that company sold them eventually to Dover Books.
Okay.
This is all pre Amazon, you understand?
Right.
And so they had a good shelf life, and I still have people tell me, "Oh, your books made such a huge difference to me."
Mhm.
In the mid '90s, a book about my work was published.
Oh.
I helped. I had to help because I'm the one who has all the visuals and has all the documentation. But the publisher, a Swiss publisher, hired some writers to do the essays in the book and an interview with me. And that book also had a good uh, a good run, a good publication life. And it too also got bought out by another company and republished in another form. So it's there's still those books are all still available, but you know, secondhand bookstores, um,
Mhm.
so on. And recently, I published a memoir that was about our my first wife and my Alzheimer's journey, called Dear Judy, a love story rewritten by Alzheimer's. But I self-published that because I couldn't find a publisher. I couldn't find an agent or a publisher who would go with it. One agent, though, did give me some very good advice, was very generous. Uh, she read the manuscript, and she she gave me some very, very good feedback in a kind of two-page single-spaced letter. And that really uh, conditioned the book. And a couple of writer friends that I sent it to also gave me some really good feedback. That, in fact, their feedback at the point where I was about to start the fourth draft of the book completely changed the book.
Mhm.
I had to come really kind of rewrite the whole book. And I also was working with very an excellent editor, uh, Sarah Disbrow, who worked at the University of Nebraska Press for part of her career. And she was sort of the primary editor. So I had good inputs on that book. And I just decided that if I, given my age, stage in life, uh, it was not likely I'd find a publisher for that book. So because it was the bicentennial, the pandemic year, my my financial guide said, "You're not doing any of the traveling you'd plan to do, so just use that."
Yeah.
So I was able to
Mhm.
self-publish it.
Mhm.
Um, I don't want to get into that, but I would probably never do that again.
All right.
Be
So then
advised.
the next questions I think we've already touched on. How was your research funded? What other techniques did you use? So I think we got a good handle on that. Um,
let me say something. I
Yep.
always like to
Okay.
give credit where credit is due. And
Yep.
I always tell this, it's old news. I mean, most people don't even know this existed, but back in the 70s and 80s and 90s, the National Endowment for the Arts
Mm,
gave individual artists fellowships,
mhm.
and then local state organizations like the Boston Arts, the Massachusetts Arts Council, or the Boston Center for the Arts, and various others gave grants to artists. And as a studio maker, independent, self employed, those were huge to get one of those. And I was very fortunate. I got quite a few of them over the course of, the first part of my career through the 80s into the beginning of the 90s. Well, the National Endowment for the Arts, thanks to a big controversy that involved the photographer Robert Mapplethorpe, ended up, they failed to defund the National Endowment for the Arts, but they managed to get the National Endowment for the Arts to stop all individual artist grants, except for traditional arts or folk arts, because those, I guess, were deemed safe. So that opportunity no longer is available to studio artists like myself. But I, I got three National Endowment for the Arts fellowships over the course of my career. The one in the late '70s, then one in the first part of the '80s, and actually, it was not in the first. It was in the later '80s, I think '87 or '88, and with that particular iteration of the individual artist fellowship, they offered me uh, they offered me a separate grant that was to participate in a residency in the south of France at a art foundation called the Lanapoule Art Foundation, an American owned and administered organization that has this property in the south of France near Cannes. And I spent 3 months there in the fall of 1990 on this residency, and it was you. I know you had another question about sabbaticals, and this
Yep.
was sort of a sabbatical
Mhm.
then when I was still an independent maker, and it was one of the best experiences of my career with some wonderful artists with whom I still am good friends, close friends. We communicate still to this day. And um, once I got into academia, because I was I was tenure track in the first part of my appointment, so I didn't have time to get. There was a long list of people ahead of me for faculty development leaves. Once I became chair, I also no longer kind of qualified. So I never had faculty development leave during my tenure at UNL, but that single one
Mhm.
in 1990 was
Mhm.
worth, and that was a very significant moment in the development of my work because I had a problem that I had in mind that I wanted to resolve, and it gave me the time and the physical remove that I needed to completely go back to square one and kind of rethink my work. And I only worked on paper for those mostly doing oil crayon drawings, big, some very large drawings slash paintings. I don't know what to call them. A lot of them are rolled up in my closet here still. Um, but it was a big, big, big moment in my career. So I have enormous, I always will thank the National Endowment for the Arts. And in fact, some years ago, the former chairperson, I think she was chair, she may have been chair when I got that particular fellowship. The actress Jane Alexander
Mm.
spoke at the induction of the president of Doane College
Mm.
nearby in Crete, and I was friends with him and uh, sort of outside of academia, and I got invited to the installation, and she gave the talk, and afterward, I went up to her and I said, I told her a little bit of this story, and I said, I'm this is an opportunity I've wanted my whole life to be able to thank somebody
Mm.
who I still see as kind of an embodiment of the National Endowment for the Arts. So, uh, I know this from being on this side of the fence that these grants, these types of things are huge in the development of careers, of artists' careers. And they're always the first thing to go. Um, and that's, of course, you know, it seems to be this country's modus operandi. Anyway.
Sure. So let's talk more about your work here. So, was your work ever involved in a controversy, and how was it resolved?
Oh, I mentioned it earlier. That only thing that I can think of is my writing about the state of the quilt world back in 1996 and 87, something like that.
Okay.
But other than that, uh, usually don't associate quilts with controversy.
Right. No.
Textiles are kind of soft. They're soft things. They're always associated with the domestic sphere and with
Mhm.
uh, homemaking enterprise and so on and so forth. So it's not really where you look to find anything that's particularly controversial. Um, so no.
And let's see. So we've done societies and sabbaticals. How about service? So while you were chair, you talked about the Research Council. Anything else stand out in your mind
Oh
of?
God, I was always on so many committees, and when you chair, you just that's all you do is just go
Yeah.
to meetings. And
Yeah.
I understand that's how organizations operate. It's just we haven't found better mechanisms, I guess. Although today, the this kind of digital platform,
Mhm.
I think it helps a lot
Mhm.
uh, to kind of to lessen the stress of those kinds of involvements. I will say this, and I've always said it, and I saw it, I witnessed it many, 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 many times in meetings, both in the department and in the college and in the Institute of Ag and across the university. A committee is a cul-de-sac down which you take good ideas and quietly strangle them to death.
All
That's
right.
what I'll say about committees.
So, what courses did you teach more often than others, and what are your thoughts about those courses?
I taught my first 5 years, a big focus of my teaching was what then and now is defunct, the visual literacy
Oh, yeah,
program.
right.
And VisLit, as we called it, was a cooperative program between the uh, the Hickson Lee College of Fine and Performing Arts, the College of Agriculture, the College of Education and Human Sciences. We added the College of Journalism, and faculty from each of those colleges taught in this program. And the
Mm-hmm.
courses that we taught were first year foundation design, basically courses. They had a lecture component, and we pooled intellectual resources and time to develop a program that would service all of these different majors from different parts of the university. And at any one time, there'd probably be in the vicinity of I don't know, 300 students,
Wow.
in this split into all these sections.
Mhm.
So, there were studio sections in each of the buildings of the participating, you know, and I, of all my 6 years in art school, the first year was the most where I had most profound learnings. And I think that was the case for these kids. And I
Mhm.
loved teaching in that domain. And I loved the intellectual stimulation of interfacing with faculty and all these other areas. So, you expanded your social, uh, uh, you know, perimeter a lot. And so that was great. And I taught some courses in the department that were design related. And then later, after I became chair, well, Viz Lit eventually disappeared. Uh, and that's a whole other story. But,
Yeah.
the universities are histories of things that flourish and then,
Yeah.
for whatever reason, disappear.
No, I always thought Vislit sounded like a great course.
It was.
I
It
know
was.
Martha Horvey, who I think took
Yeah.
over after you,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
sounded like a wonderful course.
It was. It was brilliant. So anyway, then my teaching as chair really narrowed a lot because I only had a 10% teaching appointment. So basically that was one course a year. And occasionally I'd teach each semester and do it, but double it. But typically I had one semester where I taught, and it was usually, they were all related to the quilt studies program.
Mm.
So, history of, well, what I can't even think of the names now. Aesthetics in the quilt was one, and um, the studio quilt movement was another. That was kind of a art history for
Mm.
quilts, for non-traditional quilts, I would say. And I had and those were almost all. Well, they were pretty entirely graduate level courses, and most of my students were non-traditional grad students. So almost the entirety of that teaching was done online. Uh, so from 2007 to my retirement 13 years later, pretty much I only taught online. And so it's kind of ironic that I retired on January 31st, 2020, with all this experience of online teaching. And you know what happened six
I
weeks
do know what
later,
happened. I
you
was
know,
there.
yeah. And unfortunately, there were still faculty in my department who'd never taught online. But, that's how the cookie crumbles.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
We all had to learn.
Yeah.
But yeah, I had practice online already. So let's move on to your youth. Where did you grow up and what was your childhood like? I think we heard a little bit.
I grew up in New Bedford, Massachusetts, a tired, sort of directionless farmer mill town. New England is filled with them.
Okay.
Uh, I lived the first 50 years of my life, minus 3 years in grad school when I was in upstate New York. But, you know, I finished grad school. We were 4 years up there. I take that back because after I graduated, we stayed an extra year and then decided that there was no reason to stay in a place where the winters were interminable, and the cloud cover was interminable. So, and the snow was interminable. So we moved back to Massachusetts. But I consider that I lived the first 50 years of my life in southeastern Massachusetts.
Mhm.
After I'd married and we had a child, we lived in my wife's hometown, which was Somerset, Mass, which is a suburb of Fall River. And Fall River is like 20 minutes down I-195 from New Bedford. So
Mhm.
uh, another, you know, another worn out um, textile mill town. And uh, as I said earlier, working class family, tenements. I lived in a 3-story tenement till I was 21, across the street from a huge mill.
Wow.
It it's great actually now in hindsight. I mean, I don't complain about my childhood. It was wonderful. It was a very diverse community, lots of Portuguese neighbors, Polish neighbors, obviously all the French Canadians, Irish. It was very, very diverse ethnically. Um, and, you know, summertime, you'd be out in the street with 20 other kids.
Mm,
You know,
mm,
it was kids don't grow up that way anymore. So that was great. Um, and we were poor, but we didn't know we were poor. So
mm.
that's fine too. Um, but um,
Well,
I'm
what do you think sparked your interest in going to college and then majoring in art? How did that happen?
I'll tell you this. When I was 5, I loved to draw from when I was when I could hold a pencil.
Mhm.
Interestingly, my two brothers who follow me, there were four boys kind of in a row, and then a space of 5 years or so, and then three girls in a row. And the first three of us, myself, my next brother, and my third brother, all of us got art degrees.
Oh.
And this is so bizarre because this was a
Mm.
family that did not go to museums.
Oh.
We didn't do it. Wasn't done. We didn't travel. We didn't go on vacation. It wasn't part of our life at all.
Mhm.
But my mother liked to do crafty type things. And on rainy days, she would give us, I mean, she was going nuts with seven kids. And, you know, she had to do something with us in a tiny little 3 bedroom apartment. We had 9 beings living
Mm.
there, probably in total of maybe 750 square feet. I've tried to calculate it and it's somewhere like that. Wasn't much. Um, so she always had like stuff to paper to draw on and construction paper to make things with. And uh, so I loved doing that. And my brothers did too. We all enjoyed that. And we would do it ourselves. We'd do it together. And on Friday nights, my father he was a clerk in a grocery store. He worked for an A&P, Great
Mm.
Atlantic and Pacific Tea Company.
Mhm.
And he would come home on Friday with the ends of the pads that he used to
Oh.
write everything out, calculate stuff. And he'd give us the ends of the pads, and then we'd do little flip books, you know, movie things, or we'd draw and we'd say, let's draw this. And then we'd each do our versions. So by the time I was 5 or 6, people said to me, what do you want to be when you grow up? And I'd say, I want to be an artist.
Oh.
And I never wavered. I did think at some, points along the way, well, maybe I should be an architect. Maybe I should go into architecture because then I could probably make a real living or whatever. I understood that being in the arts was not a way to have a conventional, you know, career.
Mhm.
But I got my father when I was 15 years old to take me by myself, no siblings. That was really important. It's the only thing he ever did with me, just the two of us, where I didn't have younger siblings. I was the oldest. I didn't have younger siblings trailing around. He took me to Boston to go for the first time to the Museum of Fine Arts. And the reason I wanted to go was because at that point I had started subscribing to Art News magazine,
Wow.
which my parents, fortunately, it came with a brown cover wrapping because the very first number I got was a cover that showed a painting by Larry Rivers of his mother-in-law, Gertie Birdie, I think. I can't remember, but he painted for part of his career in a particular series. He painted these nude portraits of his mother-in-law, and this was on the cover. And I mean, if my mother had seen that, she would have totally lost it. But anyway, I had been reading this magazine for a while, and the Boston Museum of Fine Arts was always represented in some point. So I finally asked my father if he would take me up there, and he agreed. So he and I went to Boston. He didn't know Boston. We only lived an hour from it, but he didn't know Boston. But he had been to to Fenway Park for a ball game.
Mm.
So he knew that the museum wasn't too far from Fenway Park. But so what he did was he parked at the John Hancock Center, which was a fairly new then,
Mm.
big complex of office buildings and convention center and so on. And we walked from there to the museum, which was quite a long walk. But anyway, when I walked into that place, that was it. It was like I had come home. This was my place. So, from there I went. And my parents wanted us to go to college, but they didn't care what we studied. It wasn't like, law or medicine or 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 business, it was as I could have done anything,
Mm.
whatever
Mm.
I so
So
that's it.
you went to school, you got your degrees. When was your first exhibition? Was it as an undergraduate or graduate
Oh,
student?
I was exhibiting in local shows
Oh,
yeah, as an undergraduate. They
okay.
were group shows, but
Sure.
everybody, would try to get their work in a show. I got a gallery on Nantucket to show my work for a while. Um, I went out there a couple of times. So I know I went to at least one opening where I had work on the wall
Mhm.
of a gallery on Nantucket. Um, and we eventually, there were shows in Providence that we would sometimes submit work for. Um, so there was exposure there, and same in grad school. And
Yeah, but the very first one typically is very memorable.
mm, no, no, these weren't. It
If it's
wasn't
a
like New York or
no, if it's a group show in college,
this was New Bedford, Massachusetts. It's or Fall River, even Providence. Providence, there was a little more status in showing in Providence because, of course, much bigger city, much more arts oriented. Rhode Island School of Design, of course, is there.
Mhm. Right.
So, but it was after it just kind of like grew organically,
Mhm.
and you
So,
I did have a solo show of my quilt work in 1977 at uh, a college in Brockton, Mass. What was the school? I can't think of it right now. But that was my first quilt sort of solo show, and then it's kind of
uh,
went from there.
so in retrospect, how far did your independent quilt studio work diverge from your graduate work? I didn't really get a sense of what you were painting in graduate school.
Nothing even remotely
Nothing.
similar. Nothing. No, no, zero, zero, no connection. Other than that, the paint went on fabric, and I was working in fabric, but
Yeah.
visually, no,
Okay.
zero connection.
So then we're on to the very last part, the personal. Tell us about your family. We heard that you had a wife and then children.
Uh, my first wife and I had a son, Trevor, who's now living in Madison, Wisconsin, and he's in the tech industry. He's working for a firm now. He basically he went to art school also. He got his undergraduate degree at Alfred University in upstate New York, about 2.5 hours or so south of Rochester. And Alfred is known. It's part of it's a private liberal arts school, but it has the arts part is the school is the New York State College of Ceramics at Alfred. It's part of the SUNY
Oh.
State University of New York system. And so he was in that art, but he wasn't interested in ceramics. So he did, uh, he was focused on printmaking mainly. But eventually his interest morphed toward fabric as well. And he ultimately, well, I don't know why I'm telling you his history, but uh, he did actually end up working uh, sort of tangentially with fabrics after an internship that he did at the fabric workshop in Philadelphia. But anyway, he's no longer a visual artist at all. But of course, he does have a good understanding of the world, and he's backgrounded in it pretty well. So I'm confident that he can help to uh, keep my work somewhat visible after after I've gone off into the ether. um, so anyway, Judy and I met in undergraduate school, married when I was in grad school, and when she was, uh, she worked in the home sewing industry basically, and eventually in 1989, she and her partner opened a fabric store retail operation of their own. They had worked in someone else's for the 10 years previous to that. And they had this store for 10 years and it was quite decently successful. And, but at the end of that, as both Judy and I were approaching our 50th birthdays, we both were sort of feeling a bit of, like, we gotta, is this all there is? Sort of, is this what we're going to be doing for the rest of our lives? And that is part of what landed us in Nebraska. And when we came here, she decided to go back into the department and do a degree in textile design because that's what she really wanted. She had had an art background. She was in photography and graphic design. So we our whole lives had been lived together in that kind of sphere. So this gave her an opportunity to work uh, creatively without having, not for an audience, not for a clientele, but for herself. And so she did that, and then she built her career, and unfortunately, the disease put an end to that. But in a short period of time, she got quite well recognized, and even internationally, had a number of. She had solo shows overseas, and so it was short lived, but it was also well lived, and the work lives on. I'm looking at a piece now, and it was very strong work. So, is that answer that
Yep, no,
question?
that's fantastic.
Yeah, I have
Be
since remarried. I should
oh,
add
yep,
that, and
yep.
so I've acquired um, five extra grandchildren.
Okay.
My son has two, so I have two grandchildren through him. So, yeah.
Then before retirement, what did you do for relaxation or entertainment?
It wasn't much of that thinking, you
Mhm.
know? A lot of people say reading is their hobby. Reading was never my hobby. Reading was like eating and sleeping. It's not extra. It's not if I have time for it. It's daily consumption without which I would not be able to live. Um, and you know, we traveled a lot over those years, but almost all the travel that I've done over the course of my career has not been vacation travel. It's been uh, professional travel, but that always allowed for a lot of exposure. You know, if I went to Europe for 3 weeks in any particular May or June, which was fairly frequent, you know, I taught 6 hours. I taught a workshop 6 hours a day, and then I spent the rest of my time exploring,
Mhm.
going to museums and art centers and seeing architecture and blah 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 blah. So all of that was again a cumulative piece of it. But yeah, I don't know, hobbies. I don't know. I've never thought in those terms. So
So then, since you retired, how do you spend your time?
well, as I said earlier, I'm working on this book, so I'm doing a lot of research. I am making a lot of runs to to downtown campus to Love Library to get mostly into library books because they don't have a lot of the books I need, but I'm finding them. Um, and I'm immersed in that really. I'm writing on Substack a bit. I've been writing about the uh, in hindsight a bit about the Alzheimer's experience
Mhm.
as a kind of tangent to the publication of Dear Judy, uh, the appearance in 2025 of the Kindle version of the
Mhm.
digital of the
Mhm.
online version of the book,
Mhm.
which was belated. But and I've been writing and trying to bring interest to it, but that's shifting too. I'm not going to stick in that narrow uh, tunnel of uh, of subject area, but
But it's
um,
historical fiction.
I'm doing some. Yeah, it's the book that I'm working on is historical fiction. It's comes out of I'm basically imagining lives for some of my ancestors, and it's I almost feel a kind of mission in it now because when although I don't know much about that, I only have very sketchy details um, of the ones that I'm focused on in this book. I fortunately have a photograph of one of the three principals in the book. So I'm going to imagine lives for them. Well, there were millions like them, you know? So part of my what I'm getting out of it is learning about the lives of these millions of people. And this story, whether it's even close to what they actually lived, it doesn't matter. There's no way I can know. And it doesn't matter because there were so many of them. And, the people who get written about, you know, who are the people that get written about? It's not the workers
No,
generally,
no.
very rarely. So I want to, I want to give them lives. And I'm doing this really, I don't know if it'll ever see the light of day and that doesn't matter. I have these granddaughters. They're going to have a sense of what this history was that they really, for all intents and purposes, know almost nothing about
Mhm.
because they did not grow up in New England. They grew up in Maryland. They grew up in the Mid-Atlantic region.
Mhm.
Completely different upbringing. So nothing about New England really resonates with them because it's not part of their experience. This will
Mhm.
be a door into that. And I've often thought, and I thought this with the memoir, um, how many, oh, and this is actually something that ties to my writing now because how I wish that these people that I had inherited a batch of letters or a journal or a diary.
Mhm.
Well, the ones I'm talking about, they were illiterate.
Oh,
So they wouldn't have left that,
right.
So when I'm looking for diaries and letters, it's always the upper class that's represented,
Oh, yeah.
or the professional class. But
Right.
workers didn't have a voice beyond their small communities.
Mhm.
So that's that's part of what I want to do. And hopefully it might mean something to them. I think this, down the line, I hope they'll feel grateful that they have these records, essentially, my memoir, certainly. Uh, I did a small edition of a couple of books about my first wife's life, specifically for them and for other
Mm,
family members.
mm,
So it's nothing that went out
mm,
publicly.
mm.
And that exists, and they'll have that. And I think when they're 60, 70 years old, they will value that. It's when, because people have lives to live and lives are complicated. You don't have time for that till you're up there, till you reach the end zone,
Mm.
you know? So,
Okay, well, thank you very much for talking to me today. I've enjoyed hearing your story.